Hello there. Happy Thursday. Welcome to another episode of the Chuck ToddCast. Today, a solo round of things. Obviously, big development in the last 24 hours with President Trump's decision to rescind or pause the tariff regime, which had been in place for a couple of hours, leading to another market meltdown. And particularly, we think the thing that truly rattled the president was what was happening in the bond market. But I'm not here to play CNBC guy for you. There are plenty of smart financial guys. If you want to go down that road, you can go down that road. I'm here to talk about the politics of this moment, what to learn from this moment, and what it could mean, and how to watch sort of reaction going forward. So what to take away from this? Well, bottom line is Donald Trump blinked. The question is, why did he blink? Going into this, there was always a belief, almost like a security blanket belief among the business community, who towards the end of 2024 accelerated in their support generally of Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. And it was the basic reasoning being regulation. Donald Trump was campaigning on doing all these tariffs, and all of these sort of business leaders were kind of compartmentalizing, believing, oh, he's not as serious. The tariffs he did the first time weren't that damaging. If that's all he's going to do, we can handle it. Didn't necessarily believe that he was willing to go where he was going to go. I think the biggest reason why there's been so many miscalculations about Donald Trump 2.0 versus Donald Trump 1.0 is simply the missing people that were very involved in putting together Trump's first administration. Mike Pence and Reince Priebus. Reince Priebus was the first chief of staff. He was chairman of the RNC when Donald Trump got elected president, and then he got named chief of staff. And Mike Pence was the vice president, and Mike Pence was in charge of the transition. Well, we now know in hindsight, particularly after watching the first 80 days of Trump 2.0, that what Mike Pence and Reince Priebus did in stacking that administration in Trump 1.0 was to put in a whole slew of guardrails in the form of personnel, whether it was Gary Cohn, who was worked on the White House economic team and literally snatched documents away from President Trump from getting rid of trade agreements with South Korea at one point, or Jared Kushner versus Donald Trump Jr. Jared Kushner, very much a bit more of an internationalist, a bit more friendly to private equity. Donald Trump Jr., a bit more culturally conservative and pugilist. And he's the family member with the most influence on Donald Trump right now. The last time it was Jared Kushner who was the family member with that kind of influence. And I could go on, but I think it is pretty clear that Trump 1.0 had a lot more guardrails preventing Trump from governing by instinct. That is not what has been happening in Trump 2.0. He has been governing by instinct. It is why the tariff regime was announced. It is why the tariff regime was put into effect even for a few hours. There is nobody around him to tell him no. Now, clearly what happened here is a couple of things. One, the markets, didn't right themselves. They sort of, over the weekend, comforted themselves to believe that, it was, once people digested this, it wouldn't be so bad. It was bad, particularly in the bond markets. So clearly they realized they had a problem. And a lot of wealthy people have Donald Trump's cell phone. And I'd said this before with members of Congress, that they were going to start feeling heat directly from their most important constituents. Important, of course, in quotes, meaning their most financially significant constituents, who all have their congressman and senator on speed dial as well. And they were all complaining about these tariffs. It's why you had, arguably for the first time, multiple elected Republicans going on the record criticizing the tariffs. They were gentle about Donald Trump, the individual, saying, well, I know what he wants to try to do, but I'm not sure these tariffs are going to be, or the Tom Tillis quote, who do I choke if this doesn't work? But he was saying things like, if this doesn't work, Ron Johnson clearly didn't like any of these tariffs, but he's been pretty supportive culturally of a lot of things of the MAGA movement, and he didn't want to sound anti-Trump in how he did it. But they were all speaking out. You had bills introduced in the House and the Senate. You had 7 Republican senators ready to sign on to a bill that would essentially give the tariff power back to the legislative branch and take it away from the executive branch. So I think that this is times 100 with Donald Trump. Every major donor of Trump's has a cell phone because Donald Trump loves to get their calls. He loves to talk to them. And they all were talking to him, and they were all trying to cajole him, convince him. They weren't yelling at him, but they were all begging him. And then Donald Trump weirdly enjoys being seen as playing the role of savior. And there's no doubt in my mind that the best way to get him to act is, you can really help the economy right here. You alone can make this happen. So there are all sorts of ways that people have learned to play play the Trump personality, to sort of, you know what you're going to get. How do you use it? Can you cajole it? Certainly over the last few days, there was some doubt creeping into my head a little bit, and some doubt creeping into the head of others that maybe this is a different Trump. Maybe he so believes in tariffs that he is not going to let outside forces influence him and show him what reality looks like. But that wasn't the case. So I think the big takeaway is he still cares what rich people think. And it was the wealthiest people on Wall Street that were screaming the loudest, including many people that had become important supporters and advocates of him. Bill Ackman, who's become a very polarizing figure in the finance community, but certainly is somebody very loudly in favor of Trump and then very loudly complaining about the tariffs. You had Elon Musk complaining with Peter Navarro. So the point is, I think the lesson to take away here is that pressure still works with Trump. He may not have the Thelma and Louise gene that I thought perhaps we were all staring at here, that, boy, he was willing to drive off that cliff no matter the evidence, no matter what people were saying. That is not what happened. The question is whether he's already done a lot of damage. He showed some weakness. Now he's showing a bit of indecisiveness, right? Sometimes indecisiveness can be just as damaging as being sort of wrong and strong, right? So I'm not saying he's politically out of the woods. I don't think he's going to recover, but clearly he saw that his own political ratings were going upside down. He was 10 points in the negative on one poll I saw earlier on Wednesday, that had his numbers upside down on the economy. His numbers in the economy look like what Joe Biden's numbers on the economy looked like at the end of 2024. Needless to say, that's not a good look. He's also a guy trying to get Congress to do a very difficult budget proposal that will give him his big tax cut. It's not an easy vote for some of these members of Congress. So here he was creating this horrible political environment for the Republican Party, a shaky economy, and he was cajoling these people to vote for a budget that may or may not be very popular with the public. That was a lot to ask. And I think that he had a big vote in Congress that he needed to get through. This goes back to the criticism I'd leveled earlier. Forget whether you think it's a good policy. Let's assume you accept the premise that the policy Donald Trump is pursuing is a good idea, which is figure out how to use tariffs in order to sort of get manufacturing back in America. Well, he didn't order his agenda very well. He should have been focused on the tax cut and his budget first, doing DOGE and the budget, doing all of that in the first 6 months. And then if you read Owen Cass, who is basically a big defender ideologically of what Donald Trump is trying to do, in the New York Times, he laid out a more rational way he could have done this. And ironically, he even talked about creating 90-day windows. Well, here we are with a 90-day window. It does appear as if that I think what we're likely to see is these tariffs will come back, but it's probably going to be a bit more methodical. My guess is Peter Navarro has been shoved back into the line a little bit of advisors, but it doesn't mean Donald Trump's belief in tariffs is going to go away overnight, even if Peter Navarro is not in the room or sitting as close to Trump in his ear as everybody else. And it is clear that Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, another big advocate of this tariff policy, is also wearing out his welcome with some staff and with some key supporters. So I do think the most polarizing figures behind this policy, Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick, you're going to see them sort of be pushed aside a little bit. These tariffs are going to come back. but it's more likely now that they're going to be a bit more methodical and there'll be at least a little bit more predictability. I don't know if they're going to be any less impactful, though, on the consumer. And if the cost of living goes up on consumers, even if it's just a directed tariff on China, I am skeptical that that is going to be something that Republicans can continue to overcome. No. You must sacrifice to go get China. I am skeptical that even the most devoted of MAGA folks will have the patience beyond a few months here or there. But look, it is. I could tell you this, there are a lot of Republicans that are relieved. It's sort of like one of those moments, okay, they got through this crisis, but let's remember, we're still not at the 80th day of this presidency, let alone day 100. We still have at least more than 1,000 days left in Donald Trump. So 1,000 days of this potential policy gyration, instability. Ask yourself, is business really going to assume everything is now normal and the way it was? Or are they now going to have to take this moment where they have breathing room and essentially prepare for more disruption and more instability? In my conversations already with some business leaders over the last 24 hours, it's pretty clear now they're going to use this breathing room to essentially truly prepare for some of these potentially worst case scenarios when it comes to international trade. So there's sort of my quick sort of 24 hours later reaction. Of course, in the era of Trump, you always have to be careful. What you think is happening in the moment can suddenly change on a dime, as many a person on Wall Street has learned. But for now, I think that's the situation where he has at least stopped the political bleeding that was starting to become a gusher, really, had he continued to follow through with these tariffs the way they were executed. A lot of times in these solo shows, one of the things I want to do in these shows is a few things. I want to sort of deal with what I call errors and omissions, meaning there's some topics I didn't get to in the week that I kind of wanted to give not necessarily a hot take, but call it sort of hot analysis that I think is at least sharing with you how a development in a political race is sort of changing my thinking about the battle for control in 2026. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. And then there's some omissions, some things that either I meant to do and I never said, or I promised, like in the last episode, I talked about sort of my take on what's wrong with the current state of media and journalism. And I sort of told you, I said, well, I have this whole thing about O.J. Simpson. And I said, well, I'm going to put a pin in that and get back to you. Well, I'm pulling the pin back out. So I'm going to start my sort of cleanup section of this episode of the ToddCast with sort of finishing my analysis there about the O.J. Simpson angle to this. So when you think about sort of how the media became what it has been, very narrative driven, right? Everything seems to be about narrative rather than, about policy in the moment or about the facts in the moment. I think one of the great sort of mistakes, big mistakes that big media has made in my lifetime. I go back to 1994, and I know for some of you listening to this, you're like, hey, that's before I was born. What do I give a shit about that? Well, here's what happened in 1994. 1994, at the time, we had one cable news channel at the time, CNN. There were not three yet. There was just one. And in 1994, we had arguably the most famous crime of the 20th century. One of the most famous people in America was accused of double murder. O.J. Simpson was a football star and a TV star, actually a movie star. And everybody loved O.J. Nobody didn't, now if you look up O.J., you think, he's this. Before 1994, people just loved O.J. Simpson. He was just a football hero. O.J. Simpson being accused of double murder was the equivalent of if Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Derek Jeter, somebody like that. That's how beloved O.J. was. It was beloved the way a Peyton Manning's beloved or a Tom Brady. You'd be like, well, there's no way that guy would do that because he was in our living rooms all the time. So it was a big deal. Don't get me wrong. It was a big deal, but it was entertainment. Big deal, not hard news. Big deal. But CNN made an interesting decision. Before that, CNN had a reputation of being, boy, they were covering the first Iraq war better than any news organization had ever covered a war. It had really looked like they'd sort of redefined what 24-hour news meant. So they were writing the rule book. There really wasn't 24-hour news organizations before there was CNN. And it was really seen as sort of a high pillar of journalism, big J journalism, if you will. And they made a ratings decision. It was the first time they made a decision. They saw that we had something called Court TV at the time, and we were taking advantage of cameras in the courtroom. And Court TV was covering all the preliminary hearings. And CNN had never worried about ratings before, noticed Court TV was outrating them. And they were like, whoa, maybe we ought to cover the OJ trial. Well, cover the OJ trial they did. And CNN made so much money covering the OJ trial, dedicating hours every day just to the trial, with occasional interruptions of other news happening around the world, that both NBC and Fox decided they too were going to start cable news channels. They didn't start cable news channels because they thought the public wants more news. They started cable news channels because they saw, look what CNN did at the big event and how much money they made. We're not going to leave that kind of money on the table. And from then on, what it did, and what I believe the bad gene that this planted in the media business was this. Before O.J. Simpson, news divisions that were owned by big media companies, as long as they didn't lose money, they were fine. After O.J. Simpson, media executives and the bean counters said, oh, well, you can make money on news if you make it interesting. And from then on, I argue that the television news business, and frankly, the news business in general, truly started to figure out, how do we package this to make it more interesting, to make more clicks and eyeballs and all this stuff. And of course, social media comes along, algorithms comes along, and all of this ends up on steroids. But when you're asking, whenever I'm asked the question is, how did we get to where we got with this current state of media and journalism? I do think one of the sort of the core mistakes, the initial mistakes that was made, was a decision that the single most important news event in America for a 6-month period was when a news organization decided the trial of a celebrity accused of murder is more important than war in Central Europe, or the battle over whether there should be national health care for everybody. These were some of the stories that were taking place at the time. The advent of the internet, all these other news stories that would have normally gotten coverage but didn't because of OJ. So anyway, I do think we sometimes forget that our business made some mistakes that created the conditions that sort of created this media circus that we all now find ourselves participants and viewers of these days. So there's that. A few other things that I want to point out. Tuesday was an election day. An incumbent mayor lost in St. Louis. Why am I making a big deal of this? Because I have a feeling that it's going to be a bad year for incumbents. And if you want to look for canaries in the coal mine about the midterm elections, keep an eye on there's a lot of vulnerable mayors. We've already had, a new mayor elected in San Francisco. We got a new mayor in St. Louis. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, is unpopular. I doubt he wins re-election. The point is, these off year elections, when you start to see incumbents go down, and there may have been for parochial reasons or this or that, but it tells you there's a vibe for change. There's a vibe for change out there. So just something to keep in mind. Texas Senate, probably the single biggest development in the battle for control of Congress in 2026. Why am I saying this is a big deal? Because it's two parts. Number one, this is sort of a huge showdown between two wings of the Republican Party. I still think it's possible that what Donald Trump is doing with tariffs is going to fracture the Republican Party between the sort of, think of it as the Romney-Bush wing, free trade, Chamber of Commerce wing on one side, and the populist, nationalist, Donald Trump wing on the other. Well, we're going to see a massive sort of heavyweight primary fight in Texas. John Cornyn, sort of more of the avatar of the traditional version of Republicanism pre-Donald Trump, and then the Attorney General there, Ken Paxton, who is very much a Trump, more MAGA related, believes in using government, weaponizing government in a way that many conservatives pre-Trump wouldn't have felt comfortable doing with government. So this is going to be a massive fight. A Ken Paxton victory in the primary makes it realistic that Colin Allred, the likely Democratic candidate who lost the last time to Ted Cruz, but was competitive, certainly raised a ton of money. I think Colin Allred has the ingredients are all there for him to win this Senate seat. If Paxton's a nominee and Donald Trump's approval rating is hovering close to 40%, that's how that would happen. And if Texas is suddenly put into play in the Senate, well, then suddenly the idea of Democrats having a 20 or 30% shot at taking control of the Senate is actually realistic. Right now, I put their percentage chances in the teens. This is a tough map for them, but if they get that, that primary now in Texas, North Carolina, Maine, Democrats are defending a lot of open seats still, and I think that's going to be the reason why they don't win the Senate ultimately. But suddenly, you're starting to see just a few more pieces being put on the game board here that might give Democrats a boxer's chance. So those are my omissions and corrections, clarifications. Again, I want to try to do that as best I can, especially if I make mistakes. By the way, I use the whole construction of seriously and literally, and I did it while on CNN with my friend Brad Todd, who is a Republican strategist, and he says, "Hey, you brought up seriously and literally. Do you take Trump seriously or literally?" Well, Brad wanted me to remind people that he is the first person to ever use those turn of phrase and said, "Hey, people are taking him too literally. You just should take him seriously." By the way, I debate what you should do, literally or seriously, with Trump all the time. I'm very curious if you guys have questions about that. And speaking of questions, I promised that I would answer, and I'm going to try to answer 3 questions here. I'm going to try to get out of, I don't want to linger too long on your feed on days that I don't have interviews, but I promised 3 questions here. So here's the Ask Chuck segment. Ask Chuck. I got some cool music now, so it's a little bit more fun, right? Ask Chuck. I love it. All right, question 1. Over the years, we have seen increasing partisanship and dysfunction in American politics and the journalism that covers it. What can ordinary citizens who consume political news do to be part of the solution and not part of the problem of hyperpartisanship in the media and politics? That question comes from Michael Hammond. Well, look, Michael, I kind of think the problem with our journalism these days, it's not locally sourced. I want my political news the way I want my ingredients at my favorite restaurants in Arlington, Virginia, which is I want those ingredients locally sourced. Well, I want my political news locally sourced. And so if I'm going to proclaim myself the news czar here, and if I could be the news czar and try to fix this problem here, the biggest thing I would do is essentially cut half of the political journalists in Washington and kick them out of Washington and send them to all 50 states, capitals, and all 200, say, major metro communities in this country to start reporting on the impact of government on the ground. This is the way political coverage used to work. Washington bureaus for smaller papers around the country did the job of explaining what government was doing from the perspective of your community rather than top-down coverage that just told you generally what legislation was going to do. We actually had these journalists who were in Washington, D.C., covering their specific member of Congress, explaining to their local readers how those local members voted, how the bill would impact community, street Y or building X, and what money would be spent right local, and people would have a better idea what government did. And if you wonder why people aren't sure what government does in their community, literally, government trees are falling around forests all over the country, and there is no one there to hear the tree or see the tree fall in the community forest. So the biggest thing we could do is try to consume your political news locally. Try to find good, trusted, local folks that you trust that understand your community and see Washington through that prism. Look, this is what I'm trying to work on, figure out if, can I help build a media company that can help support and expand and encourage the expansion of new local news and people to do this. But, it's a great question that you asked. I think the solution is we need 1,000 new local publications, 1,000 new, not 10, not 15, 1,000 community-driven news organizations that I think could help clean up the information ecosystem. All right, we go to the next question. Comes from a fellow GW alum, Drew Archer. He says he's an avid listener. Appreciate it. Don't forget, like and subscribe, like and subscribe. Did I tell you to like and subscribe? He says, I have a few questions, but I think I'm just going to take, they're kind of merging into one. Here it is. He says, do you think there's a straight line from Obama deciding not to go after the big banks in the aftermath of 2008 and the rise of Donald Trump? He says, I think there's a pretty good case to make for it, but I'm curious about your perspective too. Do you think Bernie would have defeated Trump in 2016 had he won the Democratic nomination? I think another thing worth noting here is ours didn't love it in 2016, but they listened to their voters and Trump won. I think the D's undeniably put their thumb on the scale for Hillary and didn't listen to their voters. Same thing could be said for Biden 2024. He gives me a go Hippos. That's a real sort of deep cut for GW alums, the hippo business. For now, I'll just say go revolutionaries. I'm going to save you go do your own rabbit hole on the hippos and try to understand what GW people mean about hippos. But let me answer his question there. I'll never forget a line Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff, the first chief of staff for President Obama, said he wanted to do some Old Testament justice when it came to the financial crisis. I do think the fact that nobody was frog marched, we didn't see anybody in orange jumpsuits, nobody was held accountable for doing what was done to the world economy, let alone the American economy in the housing crisis. So I do think the lack of justice in this was, in hindsight, a big mistake. I think another big mistake, which actually lawmakers learned from when they handled COVID, was they didn't throw enough money at the problem. I think, COVID, and you could argue maybe we threw too much money at the problem, but the choice was recession or inflation. And I think when you look at what happened during the Great Recession and what happened during the inflationary period of the last 4 years, trust me, most Americans would take inflation over recession every day of the week and twice on Sundays. So that is another reason. I think the not finding a way to save every house, 500,000 or less, should have not been foreclosed on. That should have been the PPP loan, if you will, of the Great Recession. So I do think that also contributed to it, but I don't think you're wrong about that. As for Bernie Sanders, I think now I come to the conclusion that Bernie probably beats Trump. I do think the Clinton last name was the problem there. I think clearly voters wanted the establishment elites out of here. Right? In many ways, between the Iraq War and the Great Recession, the assumption was the Clintons, the Bushes, all these people were responsible for this. Clean house, get rid of all. First, the Democrats cleaned house, and they got rid of the Clintons and nominated Obama. And then what did Obama do? He put his thumb on the scale for Clinton. What did Donald Trump do? He ran against the Bushes and got rid of them, ran against the Clintons and got rid of them. So under this scenario where Bernie's the outsider that slays the political dragon on his side of the aisle, I do think that Bernie is probably a much stronger candidate in the general election against Donald Trump. There's no doubt, and we see it now, right? And it's obvious now in Trump 2.0 and his success in that election that that Bernie voters in 2016 were very much more Trump curious and Kennedy curious than they ever were Clinton curious or Biden curious. So I think now it's pretty easy to see that in hindsight. But I'll tell you this, if Obama doesn't put his finger on the scale for Hillary Clinton, I actually think there's 6 or 7 other candidates that jump in this race in 2015 and 2016. And I don't think Sanders ever gets traction, but somebody else would have. And I think somebody else would have beat her, potentially. And you're right. I do think it had been a fairer, had she not been such frankly, support among rank and file insiders, which she had earned that support, I would argue. Bernie Sanders thumbed his nose at the party. So yes, there was the thumb on the scale for Clinton, but arguably she paid her dues to make sure that thumb was on her scale, right? She went to pancake breakfasts and she raised money for the party. Bernie wouldn't even register as a Democrat. So I understand sometimes the frustration among Sanders supporters, but he did not exactly try to become a member of the Democratic Party in good standing. In fact, ask yourself, is he a member of the Democratic Party? The answer is no. Do you know how many times he's promised that he would become a member of the Democratic Party since he came so close to getting that nomination? Quite a few times, and he's still not a member of the Democratic Party. All right, last question that I'm going to take, and there's others that you guys have sent in, and we'll get to that. Here's the question. Long time listener, all the way from my days at the Hotline, Meet the Press, etc. This person now lives in Milwaukee from a farm in northern Ozaukee County. I hope I said that right. In Sheboygan, and he visits Sheboygan County a lot. I love to say the word Sheboygan. Who doesn't like to say Sheboygan? Feels like you would have, it's like Shapoopy. Sheboygan. Anyway, talked to a ton of people, and he's amazed at the number of people who voted for Trump strictly because the Democratic candidate was a woman in both 2016 and 2024. Yet, of all the pollsters I listen to, no mention of this at all. I also have friends who have cabins up north, and I hear the same from them. Strictly a Wisconsin thing. Taboo to report this. I'm amazed every time I hear a 2016 or 2024 analysis and no mention of this. John Streff. Well, John, what's the gender of one of the two U.S. senators in Wisconsin? A woman, Tammy Baldwin. She's a lesbian. And she's won 3 times now. 2012, 2018, or excuse me, she's won in 2012. She's won in 2018. She's won in a presidential year. She's won in a midterm year. And she won again in 2024. So I think that here's the thing with this question. It is hard to crawl inside somebody's head. I will go to my grave believing that Hillary Smith defeats Donald Trump, but Hillary Clinton couldn't. Meaning I believe the last name was much more toxic than gender on that front. I'm not saying those voters don't exist. I'm not saying that and I've certainly seen that there's some evidence that particularly that African-American men may not have been as comfortable voting for an African-American woman for president. I've had plenty of African-American men in the political sphere claim this to me. The reason pollsters don't bring it up is some of these questions are things you can't poll because people lie. They give pollsters the correct answer. They give pollsters the answer that they think they should give versus perhaps how they feel. But when you're in that voting booth, nobody gets to see it, right? So then you do what you do. So I'm not going to sit here and rule that out. And I do think that I won't be surprised if there is more hesitancy among Democratic Party elites about supporting major women candidates in 2028. I'll be very curious whether it's AOC, Gretchen Whitmer, in particular, Amy Klobuchar, whether the perception, or even Kamala Harris, if she decides to run again, that this conventional wisdom, maybe women can't win or not right now in this presidency, that it could become self-fulfilling. But I really don't believe in either case. I think that there is more evidence. I'm not saying those voters don't exist. And guess what? I'm not a woman, and plenty of women in my life disagree with me on this. So I throw it all out there. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm being definitive here. But I think the data shows that the other factors mattered too. And I think Clinton's last name, being part of the longtime Democratic elite, she was not changed. She was considered more status quo. The fact is, in theory, being a woman should have been seen as a change agent. One would argue she sort of leaned away from that. Some, and look, she's been there. Nobody's been more overanalyzed than Hillary Clinton. So I'm not going to, I don't, and here I go doing the same thing again. But I want to see what Hillary Smith would have done. Hillary Rodham, but so there's that. And, this election, the incumbent president, I don't know what sitting vice president could have won an election when the incumbent vice president that was the running mate had an approval rating under 45%. Hubert Humphrey couldn't win when LBJ was unpopular. Al Gore couldn't win when Bill Clinton, personal character, was unpopular. George H.W. did win as a sitting vice president. Why? Because Ronald Reagan was popular. So had Biden been popular and Kamala Harris couldn't win, I think there's a stronger argument about gender or race and gender. But I just can't discount that aspect to it. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here as I promised. I hope you enjoyed this truncated version of the Thursday ToddCast. Remember, you too can ask me questions. Send them to askchuck@thechucktoddcast.com. As I like to say, don't forget the, just like the George Washington University and the Ohio State University. The Chuck ToddCast. You can't forget the. So with that, I'm going to sign off for another 24 hours or so. And hopefully I'll see you soon until we upload again.